Hello everyone, I'm Francesca Citron and I'm going to talk to you about my neuroimaging work on figurative language. This is a publication-based talk which includes an overview of all my recent work over the last few years, and then it also includes work in progress. This is my outline. I'll first define what metaphors are, and then I'll describe how metaphors are processed with a specific focus on the neural correlates. And then I'll move on to introduce our work on emotional engagement during metaphor comprehension. And then I'm going to ask the question, why? What is it that makes metaphors more engaging than literal language? Which is still an outstanding question, and I'm going to try and suggest some answers based on our empirical research, but there's still work to do. So metaphors consist of mappings between concrete and abstract concepts. They help us understand abstract concepts in more concrete terms, and they help us communicate such concepts. So if I say he's a sweet boy, here I use sweet taste, which is something close to our sensory motor representations, to talk about something more abstract, which is kindness. And so these are other examples. She's one of the brightest students. Here I drew upon the visual domain, so light, to describe intelligence, which is a more abstract concept. Then the interview went smoothly, is based on texture, so touch. I was very moved at their wedding. Again, we've got some motor information there, and then I hear you, I understand you, I feel your pain. Here I'm drawing upon the hearing domain. How are metaphors processed? Well, conventional metaphors are very easy to understand. They're very quickly understood, and their metaphorical meaning is accessed directly. In other words, we don't need to retrieve word by word the literal meaning before we can understand the metaphorical meaning of a common expression. Whereas in the case of novel metaphors, which are expressions that are not conventionalized, they are not shared by the speakers of a target language, in those cases, we need to first picture the literal meaning and then try to understand what the speaker wants to say. So if I say my husband is an elephant, we will first picture the literal meaning and then try to work out, does she mean that her husband is clumsy? Does she mean that her husband is big? So in the case of novel metaphors, we really need to first process the literal meaning and then through inferencing and contextual information, try to understand what the speaker wants to say. So the network responsible for metaphor comprehension involves the left and right inferior frontal gyri, which are associated with working memory, problem solving, inhibition. So all these executive functions that help us represent multiple alternatives at the same time, select between different alternatives to extract the most relevant meaning. And then we've also got the left superior temporal gyrus, which is associated with semantic processing, so meaning processing, and also meaning integration. In addition, metaphor comprehension also involves medial, prefrontal, and frontal areas, so in the very middle of the brain. So in particular, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex is associated with theory of mind, so understanding the intentions of others. And then the anterior cingulate cortex is associated with conflict processing, error detection, ambiguity resolution. So all of these are functions that we need more strongly so when it comes to metaphorical or figurative expressions more generally compared to literal language. In addition, metaphor comprehension and idiom comprehension involves activation, at least partial activation, of those sensory motor areas that are associated with the concrete domain. So if I say he kicked the bucket, in order to understand this idiom, people tend to recruit, at least in part, the motor cortex at the level of the representation of the leg. And if we say she grasps the idea, again, the motor cortex at the level of the hand will show some degree of activation. This is not only true for the motor cortex, but also for the taste cortex, the smell cortex, depending on the domain which is targeted by metaphors. So in our work, we were able to show that metaphorical formulations tend to engage readers more strongly at the emotional level compared to their literal renderings. So if you can, as you can see from the stimuli that I put here, we had metaphorical sentences and their literal counterparts that were really, really similar. She received a sweet compliment meant metaphorically versus she received a kind compliment meant literally. Here really there's one word that differs, and the two types of sentences were equal in emotional balance, emotional arousal, imageability, and other psycholinguistic properties. So yes, so what we found was that despite their similarity, despite their the two conditions being equal in many properties, the metaphorical formulations elicited stronger activation of the left amygdala compared to their literal counterparts. And so the left amygdala is associated with processing of evolutionary relevant stimuli or evolutionary salient stimuli or emotive stimuli. And so we concluded that there must be something about the metaphorical formulation that engages readers more strongly at the emotional level. And we were able to replicate this finding using different types of metaphors that were not restricted to the taste domain, but they involved other domains. We were also able to replicate this finding using metaphors embedded in short stories and therefore simulating more natural reading processes. We extended our finding to idioms, and then there's also support from other research. There's a meta-analysis of 23 neuroimaging studies of figurative language that also showed consistent activation of the left amygdala for figurative materials compared to literal materials. And obviously the advantage of a meta-analysis is that the findings are consistent across many different studies, across many different labs, and across different experimental designs. Obviously, in a meta-analysis, one cannot have control over the specific stimuli and their properties, which is what we did in our research. In addition, we have converging evidence from studies that measured physiological responses such as heart rate and pupil dilation. These are measures of emotional arousal, and these studies also showed stronger engagement for figurative materials. But why is it that metaphors are more engaging? I propose three different answers. One is maybe because metaphors may appear more appealing or beautiful. In fact, as you know, metaphors are extensively used in poetry and literary text more generally to elicit aesthetic effects. And so in our study of taste metaphors, we collected ratings for beauty and familiarity at the end of the experiment by the very same participants whose brain activity was recorded. And then we ran secondary data analysis using these ratings to see whether increasing beauty would lead to increasing amygdala activation. But instead, we found that increasing beauty was associated with increasing activation of the somatosensory cortex, which is a really interesting finding that we can discuss after the talk if you're interested. So, however, we didn't find increasing activation of the amygdala, and so this suggestion is not supported by our data, at least from this very data set. So the driver of emotional engagement doesn't seem to be beauty. So do metaphors convey richer meaning, and may this be the source of the emotional engagement? As we saw before, if we say she's a kind girl, we convey one single meaning, but if we say she's a sweet girl, there's more meaning there, because sweet girl may mean kind, may mean pretty, may mean generous, it may mean slightly different things. So there's more meaning conveyed by a metaphor compared to its literal rendering. And so in a study of idioms, we ran a functional connectivity analysis between activity in the inferior frontal gyrus and activity in the amygdala to see whether variation in activation in one of these regions is associated with variation of activation in the other region. And we found a positive interaction. So the higher the activation in the left inferior frontal gyrus, the higher the activation in the left amygdala. And so, in other words, the more executive functions we need to understand idioms, the more problem-solving activities, inhibition, selection, representation of multiple alternatives in mind. The more we need these processes, the more we also get emotionally engaged in turn, as a sort of problem-solving activity that is in some ways rewarding. Okay, so the stronger the cognitive engagement, the stronger the emotive response. And so this result suggests that it may be that the richer meaning conveyed by metaphors and idioms may drive the stronger emotional engagement. But obviously, this is one study of idioms. And finally, what about the sensory motor information? It is true that metaphors and idioms convey more meaning, but they also tend to convey more sensory information than their literal renderings. So we devised a study to try and disentangle sensory motor information from figurativeness. So usually in the typical conditions, we have sweet compliment, which is metaphorical and conveys some taste information. And then the literal rendering is kind compliment, which is literal and does not convey sensory motor information. So we included a third crucial condition where we had a literal phrase, sweet candy, which definitely conveys sensory information, and more so than, even more so than the metaphorical phrase. So these phrases were embedded in longer sentences, and we recorded pupil dilation while people were listening to such sentences for comprehension. And we found that metaphorical phrases elicited larger pupil dilation compared to both literal conditions, so both the abstract literal renderings and the concrete literal phrases. And this larger pupil dilation had an early onset, and it was a sustained effect, okay, sustained over time. So pupil dilation is a time-sensitive measure of physiological arousal. It responds to the emotional content of stimuli. It also responds to cognitively engaged tasks or cognitively engaging conditions. So what we can conclude from this study is that the stronger cognitive or emotional engagement evoked by metaphors is really due to metaphoricity or richer meaning, and it cannot be reduced simply to the presence of sensory information in the figurative stimuli. And finally, given the early onset, the effect cannot be due solely to post-comprehension pragmatic processes. Okay, it's quite an early effect. So what we can conclude is that metaphors are more engaging, not because they're perceived as more beautiful and not simply because they convey sensory motor information. They are more engaging because they convey more meaning. And then, of course, more sensory information as well. So obviously, the evidence I presented is only, I presented one study in support or not in support of each of these suggestions, of these proposals. So more research is needed to confirm this, And in particular, more research is needed to define the time course of the emotional engagement, which could be defined by using event-related potentials. Thank you for your attention. These are my contact details, and I hope to discuss with you in the chat.